Today, we uncover the shocking truth about UK cheddar cheese. Somewhere in Cornwall, inside one of the biggest cheese factories on the planet, an employee once filmed himself pulling a pollution monitor out of a wastewater tank and dropping it into a bucket of clean water, purely so the readings coming out of that pipe would look perfect while the river outside was actually turning black with sludge. Thousands of fish were wiped out. Families living nearby said the smell got so bad some days that they couldn't open a window, and a few of them couldn't even leave the house. And that's only the beginning of what we found once we started properly digging into the cheddar sitting on Britain's supermarket shelves. We found a cheese marketed straight at older shoppers as the sensible, heart-healthy choice that turned out to carry just as much salt, sometimes more, than the full-fat version sitting right next to it on the same shelf. We found a so-called traditional smoked cheese that's never been within a mile of an actual smokehouse in its life. Its smoky flavour comes out of a bottle, not a chimney, and the orange colouring you see on the rind isn't smoke at all. We found a household name that quietly cut loose more than a dozen British dairy farmers who'd supplied them loyally for years, leaving those families scrambling before the year was even out to find anyone else willing to buy their milk. We found a premium cheese with a 150-year-old story splashed across the front of the pack that finished dead last out of every single cheddar tested, the moment nobody could actually see the wrapper. We found a cheese marketed entirely on the word British, with fields and flags all over the wrapper. That's actually owned by a company on the other side of the Irish Sea, and we found genuinely disturbing footage from inside a farm supplying one of the biggest cheesemakers in the country. Footage serious enough that it forced that company to stop collecting milk from the farm overnight while it tries to work out exactly what happened there. So we've gone through the major brands currently sold in UK supermarkets, and we'll expose the 9 cheddar products you need to avoid. Then I'll tell you the 5 which are actually still worth buying. Before we get into it though, I need to ask you for something. If any of what you're about to hear gets you properly wound up, hit that hype button right now, because every single hype pushes this video out to somebody else who's still got one of these blocks sitting in their fridge without a clue what's actually behind the label. This channel exists because these companies have entire departments whose job is making sure you never look past the front of the pack. They've got the marketing budgets, the slogans, the heritage stories, the royal connections. What they don't have is any real control over what happens once enough ordinary people start asking questions and sharing what they find with each other. That's the only thing that's ever genuinely moved a company like this. Not polite letters, not strongly worded emails to customer service, but pressure, public pressure, the kind that actually costs them sales and makes the people at head office sit up and start paying attention. Every single one of us reaching for a different block next week because we actually know what's in it adds up to something these companies genuinely have to respond to, whether that's cleaning up a factory, treating farmers fairly, or simply being honest about what's in the wrapper. So hype the video, share it with your mum, your neighbour, whoever you know still reaches for the same block out of pure habit every single week without ever questioning it. And let's get into it. Number 9. Pilgrim's Choice. Pilgrim's Choice has been sitting in British fridges for decades, and the packaging does everything it possibly can to make you think of rolling green hills and proper British dairy farming. Union flag colours, that deep, confident black wrapper, the whole thing's built to read as the patriotic choice for people who want to support homegrown food. Here's what the pack doesn't shout about. Pilgrim's Choice is owned by Ornua, the same Irish dairy cooperative based in Dublin that's behind Kerrygold Butter. The label tells you it's produced in the UK and Ireland, using milk from the UK and Ireland, which is technically accurate and also doing a lot of work to stop you asking exactly where your money's actually ending up. That matters more than it might sound like, because British dairy farming's been going through a genuinely difficult stretch, with farmers across the country speaking publicly about milk prices that barely cover what it actually costs them to produce it, and plenty giving up the trade altogether rather than keep losing money on it year after year. When you pick up a block thinking you're backing a British farm, and the company behind it is actually a foreign cooperative, that's not quite the same thing as buying British, no matter how many fields are printed across the front of the wrapper. On top of all that, when Pilgrim's Choice went into a genuine blind taste test against other major brands, with nobody able to see the packaging in front of them, it didn't come out anywhere near the top of the table. People who'll happily reach for it on the shelf purely because they recognize the name didn't rate it nearly as highly once that name was taken away from them. Decades ago, picking up a block of British cheddar meant trusting that the milk genuinely came from down the road, from a farm you could practically point to on a map. These days, a label can sound just as local and patriotic, while the actual supply chain runs through an entirely different country, and most of us simply don't have the time to check. Number 8. Co-op Irresistible Somerset Mature Cheddar. If you've ever picked up Co-op's Irresistible range and felt like you were treating yourself a little, that's exactly the reaction the name's designed to produce. Somerset right there on the label, a recipe story stretching back 150 years, the word irresistible doing a huge amount of heavy lifting on the front of the pack. And to be fair, none of that's actually made up. Somerset really is proper cheddar country, and the story behind it is a real one rather than an invented one. The problem is what happened when this cheese actually went up against its rivals in a genuine blind tasting. A panel of 76 regular cheddar eaters tried it alongside several other big-name and own-brand cheddars, scored purely on flavour, aroma, appearance and texture, with no idea which block in front of them was which. Co-op's Irresistible Somerset Mature finished bottom of the entire group, marked down specifically for lacking the crumble and the depth of flavour that a properly matured cheddar's meant to have. The Irresistible range as a whole has built a reputation across other products for being the slightly nicer choice, the one you reach for when you want to feel like you're treating the family rather than just filling the fridge. Which makes this result all the more disappointing for anyone who trusted that reputation here too. That's the real risk of paying extra purely for a story printed on the front of a pack. The story doesn't actually have to match what's happening to your taste buds once the wrapper comes off, and in this case, going purely by the people who actually tasted it without knowing what they were eating, it didn't. Number 7. Cathedral City calls itself the nation's favourite, and going purely by sales figures, that's barely even an exaggeration. It's the biggest selling cheddar in the entire country by a significant distance. The logo's even built around an actual cathedral. Here's the thing though, there isn't one anywhere near where the cheese is actually made. It comes out of the Davidstow Creamery in Cornwall, nowhere near a cathedral of any description, owned by the Canadian company Saputo. Cathedral City also happens to be the only cheddar in the country to hold a royal warrant, which made the pollution case that followed even more awkward, with reports at the time suggesting the warrant could be reviewed on environmental grounds, and honestly, the cathedral logo is just about the least serious problem here. Back in 2022, Saputo was fined £1.52 million at Truro Crown Court, the largest fine an Environment Agency case has ever produced anywhere in the southwest of England. After admitting to 21 separate pollution and odour offences, stretching back across more than 5 years, the court heard that waste discharged from the site coated the River Inny in black sludge for miles at a time, decimated thousands of fish, and left nearby residents dealing with smells so bad that some of them genuinely couldn't leave their homes for days at a stretch. The detail that really seemed to stick with the judge, though, was this. 1. During the investigation, an employee actually filmed a wastewater monitor being physically pulled out of an effluent tank and placed into a bucket of clean water, so it would read as if nothing was wrong while the real discharge carried on completely unmonitored. The judge pointed directly to a poor management culture at the site, describing staff as feeling too intimidated to come forward whenever limits were being breached. Saputo's profits that year sat around £21 million, which rather makes the fine look less like a genuine punishment and more like a line item on a spreadsheet. And the bad news for Cathedral City didn't stop there either. In February 2025, Saputo cut supply contracts with 13 West Country dairy farmers who'd been supplying the company for years, representing around 20 million litres of milk a year, and leaving those farmers with effectively nowhere else to sell it. Then, in October that same year, genuinely disturbing footage emerged from inside one of the farms supplying the brand, showing cattle being pushed, kicked, and chased. Footage serious enough that Saputo immediately suspended milk collection from that farm while it investigates further, though the regulator says that so far it hasn't found grounds to act on. And after everything we've just gone through, when Cathedral City went up against other cheddars in an actual blind taste test, it didn't even win. It tied with Pilgrim's Choice, sitting behind Tesco's own brand, Davidstow, Marks & Spencer and Costello. Britain's most recognisable cheddar, backed by one of the biggest advertising budgets in the entire dairy aisle, and people still couldn't pick it out as the best once the label came off the front of the block. Number 6. Asda Just Essentials Mild Cheddar. Every supermarket has a bottom shelf, and Asda's Just Essentials range sits right on it, doing exactly the job it's designed to do for families watching every single penny right now during a genuinely difficult cost of living squeeze. There's nothing inherently wrong with budget cheese existing, plenty of people genuinely need it, and that's not really what this is about. What's worth actually knowing is what you're getting for that price. A proper mature cheddar typically spends somewhere between 9 months and a full year quietly developing flavour, sometimes considerably longer than that. Mild cheddar at the value end of the market doesn't get anywhere near that kind of time. It's pushed through far faster, using milk pooled from wherever happens to be cheapest that week. Pasteurized hard enough to strip out a good deal of the character that slower aging would otherwise build up naturally. The result tends to be a block that's more about texture than actual taste, firm, slightly squeaky, perfectly fine melted into a cheap pasta bake on a Tuesday night, but a world away from what mild cheddar genuinely used to mean. Back when it simply described a young cheese that still tasted properly of fresh grass and cream, rather than tasting of fairly little at all. If you remember cheese from your own childhood having a bit more bite even in its mildest form, that's not nostalgia playing tricks on you, that's a genuinely different production timeline doing exactly what it's designed to do, getting cheese onto the shelf as quickly and as cheaply as possible. If you're shopping on a genuinely tight budget right now, that's completely understandable and nothing to feel awkward about. Just go in knowing exactly what you're buying and knowing there are other proper budget options further down this list that taste like considerably more effort actually went into them. Number 5. Dairylea slices and cheese strings. If you grew up in Britain, there's a fairly decent chance Dairylea turned up in your own lunchbox at some point, and now it might well be turning up in your grandkids' lunchboxes too. Marketed as a fun, calcium-packed way to get children eating something that looks and feels roughly like cheese, here's where it gets a bit less fun. Dairylea is legally classed as processed cheese rather than cheddar, which means real cheese gets melted down and blended together with things like skimmed milk powder, modified starch, and emulsifying salts to give it that bendy, almost rubbery texture that never quite sets like a proper block does. Press a piece of real mature cheddar between your fingers and it crumbles apart naturally. Press a Dairylea triangle the same way and it bounces straight back like it's got a memory of its own, which tells you most of what you need to know about how genuinely different these two products are underneath the packaging. Cheese strings work on exactly the same processed base, just stretched and shaped so it peels apart into strings, marketed as a fun little activity for kids rather than simply a snack. Which makes it even easier to forget that what's being peeled apart isn't really a block of cheese in the way most of us would picture one. Back in 2007, the Advertising Standards Authority actually banned one of Dairylea's adverts outright for claiming the product was full of good stuff, ruling that the claim simply didn't hold up given how high it runs in salt and saturated fat for what it actually is. Years on from that ruling, the playful branding still aimed squarely at children and the parents doing the buying for them. Nobody's saying it's dangerous, it isn't, but it's worth knowing that what's sitting inside that wrapper bears about as much resemblance to real cheddar as a microwave meal does to a proper Sunday roast cooked from scratch. Number 4. Ilchester Applewood Smoky Cheddar. Applewood's been a fixture on British Christmas cheese boards for decades now, the orange rind and the faint smoky smell making it feel like the most rustic, traditional thing sitting on the table next to the crackers and the chutney. It isn't. Not really. That cheese has never been anywhere near a genuine smokehouse, never hung over burning applewood for hours, the way proper smoked cheese is traditionally meant to be made. The smoky flavour comes from smoke flavouring added during production, and that orange tint you see on the rind isn't a sign of any actual smoking process at all, it's paprika, dusted on purely for the look of the thing. Genuine cold smoking, the kind that gives traditional cheeses their flavour, works by slowly exposing cheese to real smoke from smouldering wood chips over a long period, drawing flavour compounds in gradually without ever melting the cheese itself. a process that takes patience and proper equipment. To be fair, all of this is listed plainly enough on the ingredients label, so nobody can really say it's been hidden from view. But the picture painted by the name and the rustic packaging is doing a lot more storytelling than the actual production process behind it ever backs up. Proper smoked cheddar does genuinely exist, made by smaller producers who really do hang their wheels over real wood for hours, sometimes days at a time. And the difference in flavour between that and a quick spray of smoke flavouring is roughly the difference between something that's actually been crafted by hand and something that's simply been made to look like it has. Number 3. Supermarket lighter and half-fat cheddars. Walk down the cheese aisle of pretty much any supermarket and you'll spot a green or pale packaged lighter or half-fat cheddar sitting right next to the regular block. Aimed squarely at shoppers keeping an eye on their weight or their general heart health, which tends to mean rather a lot of viewers around your age and mine. These ranges are deliberately placed at eye level next to the full-fat versions. For exactly that reason, the marketing teams behind them know precisely who's reaching for that shelf and why. The pitch makes perfect sense on paper. Less fat sounds like the obviously responsible choice. The trouble is that fat in cheese isn't simply sitting there doing nothing useful, it's actually where a huge amount of the flavour and the texture genuinely comes from in the first place. Strip a decent chunk of that out, and you're left with something that doesn't taste of a great deal and doesn't melt properly either, so manufacturers tend to compensate elsewhere, often leaning more heavily on salt and other additives to make up for what's been taken out. Mature cheddar already sits comfortably above what the NHS classes as high for both saturated fat and salt even before you start tinkering with it. And ironically, a fair few of these lighter versions end up no better on the salt front than the full fat block sitting right beside them on the same shelf, which rather defeats the entire point of reaching for one in the first place. If you're genuinely trying to cut down for your health, the simple, old-fashioned answer is usually just to eat a smaller piece of the real thing. Rather than a bigger piece of something that's been engineered purely to seem virtuous on the packaging, and your local shop's deli counter, if it's got one, is usually a far better place to ask honest questions about what's actually in front of you than a brightly coloured wrapper ever will be. Number 2. Cathedral City plant-based. Cathedral City's spent decades building up trust with British shoppers, and now that trust is being used to sell something that has genuinely nothing to do with the cheese that made the brand famous in the first place. Their plant-based range leans entirely on that name recognition, aimed at older shoppers cutting back on dairy for the sake of their hearts, their cholesterol, or simply for the planet. And it's worth saying that lactose tolerance does genuinely tend to ease off a bit as people get older, so the appeal to this age group in particular isn't accidental. Turn the pack over though, and there isn't a trace of actual cheese anywhere in there. It's built from water, modified starch, and coconut oil, held together with flavourings and coloured with beta-carotene to give it that familiar yellow tint shoppers expect, with nothing remotely resembling the dairy protein structure that makes real cheddar taste and behave the way it does. There's absolutely nothing wrong with a genuine plant-based cheese existing for people who genuinely like one, but borrowing decades of trust built up by an actual cheddar brand to sell what's essentially a tub of flavoured starch and oil is a rather different thing entirely, and it's worth knowing that before it ends up in your trolley purely out of habit rather than genuine choice. Number 1. Serious Pig Crunchy Snacking Cheese. We're closing out the avoid list with something you might not even think of as cheese in the traditional sense, which is rather the point of including it. Serious Pig markets its crunchy snacking cheese as a premium high-protein cheddar-based snack, the kind of thing that turns up at the till in service stations and some of the smarter supermarkets. The process behind it is essentially baking and blast-drying real cheddar until it turns into a crisp, shelf-stable wafer that barely resembles cheese at all by the time it's finished. Real cheddar is a genuinely living product. The cultures inside it keep quietly developing flavour for months, or even years depending on how long it's left to mature properly. Once you've dried that down into a crunchy snack though, that whole process stops dead, and what you're left with is something a good deal closer to a cheese-flavoured crisp than an actual piece of cheese. There's a reason your parents or grandparents never kept a bag of crunchy cheese crisps in the cupboard the way they kept a proper block wrapped in the fridge. Cheese was always meant to be something you cut a slice from, not something you tipped out of a packet. It's not remotely dangerous. It's simply worth knowing that what you're paying a snack premium for has had most of what makes cheese genuinely interesting processed straight out of it before it ever reaches the shelf. So that's the 9 cheddars worth steering clear of, or at the very least buying with your eyes properly open. Now for the bit that actually matters, the cheddar's genuinely worth your money. The good news is, you don't need a specialist cheesemonger or a trip out to a farm shop to find any of these. Most of what follows is sitting on a perfectly normal supermarket shelf right now. You've simply been walking past it for the famous name standing next to it instead. None of what follows is about spending more for the sake of it either. A couple of these are actually some of the cheapest cheddars you'll find anywhere in the shop. First, Tesco Finest Mature English Cheddar. In a genuine blind taste test, this one didn't just do reasonably well, it came out on top of the entire field, scoring 78% ahead of every famous name brand it was tested directly against. Part of the reason comes down to who actually makes it. It isn't produced in some giant industrial cheese factory chasing pure volume. It comes from Wyke Farms, an independent family producer based in Somerset that's been making cheddar the same careful way for generations. It's naturally matured for around 12 months, and the result genuinely speaks for itself, solid proof that you don't need the marketing budget of a household name behind you to make the best tasting cheddar on the shelf. You just need a producer who actually cares about the process from start to finish. There's something genuinely satisfying about the country's biggest supermarket quietly beating every famous branded name in a fair fight, simply by letting an independent Somerset producer do what it's always done best. Second, Aldi specially selected West Country Vintage Reserve Crunchy Cheddar. This one's made by Bradbury & Son, another genuinely independent producer rather than a giant conglomerate. And it picked up a gold award at one of the food industry's own respected own label competitions, with the judges describing the caramel flavor and the crunchy, crumbly texture as about as good as it gets. 9 out of 10 people who tried it said outright that they'd buy it again, and it costs a fraction of what you'd typically pay for a branded equivalent sitting right next to it. It's a genuinely good example of a discount supermarket commissioning a small proper producer to make something with real care, rather than simply chasing the cheapest possible price from the biggest possible factory. It's proof, if you needed any, that the supermarket value range, properly made by people who genuinely care, can quietly outperform cheese that costs 2 or 3 times as much purely for the name on the front. Third, Davidstow Classic 12-month. And yes, before you say anything, this one comes out of exactly the same Cornwall creamery as Cathedral City. Made by exactly the same company, we've just spent a good chunk of this video talking you out of buying from. Here's the honest reason it's still earning a place on this list. The milk that goes into it and the process it goes through are genuinely different from the standard Cathedral City line, and it's properly matured for a full 12 months rather than rushed through production. In the very same blind taste test where Cathedral City tied with Pilgrim's Choice, Davidstow Classic actually came in second place overall, sitting just behind Tesco's own brand. Same factory, same parent company, but a genuinely different cheese, simply because someone further up the chain decided this particular line deserved proper time and a better recipe rather than the fastest possible route to the shelf. It's proof that the name printed on the front of a block doesn't always tell you what's actually happening to the cheese inside the wrapper, and that sometimes the better option is sitting on the very same shelf as the one you're trying to avoid. Fourth, buy the block instead of the bag. This one isn't a specific brand at all, it's simply a habit worth breaking the next time you're stood in the cheese aisle. Pre-grated cheddar feels like a genuine time saver, but almost every bag of it is coated in potato starch or cellulose specifically to stop the shreds clumping together inside the packet, which means part of what you're paying cheese prices for is actually starch rather than cheese. It also tends to melt less smoothly and loses its flavor considerably faster once it's been shredded and left sitting in a sealed bag for days on end, because the moment cheese is grated, far more of its surface is exposed to the air, and that's when it starts losing the flavor compounds that took months to build up in the first place. Grating a block yourself takes roughly 30 seconds, costs noticeably less for the exact same weight, and melts properly into whatever you happen to be cooking. Whether that's a pasta bake, a jacket potato, or a simple cheese on toast. Fifth, Waitrose Keens West Country Farmhouse Cheddar. This is about as close as you're realistically going to get on a UK supermarket shelf to what cheddar actually meant before factories took over the entire process. It carries genuine protected status, the same kind of legal protection given to champagne, meaning it has to be made in the West Country using genuinely traditional methods. And Keens is one of only a small handful of proper farmhouse producers left in the country who still do the whole process entirely by hand. The family's been making cheese on the same farm since the very end of the 1800s, using their own herd's milk and traditional starter cultures rather than anything bought in from a lab. It's cloth-bound, aged on wooden shelves for well over a year, and develops those small, crunchy white crystals that only ever show up naturally in a properly matured cheese, given enough time. It costs more than anything else on this list, and honestly, it's the clearest reminder of exactly what got lost somewhere between an actual farmhouse and a modern factory floor. So that's the full picture. 9 cheddars genuinely worth a second thought next time you're stood in the supermarket, and 5 that are actually worth reaching for instead, whether you're after the best taste, the best value, or simply something that's been made the way cheddar was always meant to be made. If any of this changed how you'll shop this week, hit that hype button before you go. It genuinely helps push videos like this one in front of people who are still buying completely blind. Drop a comment and let me know which food you'd like us to dig into next. I read every single one of them, and they genuinely shape what we end up covering. And if you want more of exactly this, hit subscribe, because there's plenty more of this coming. Until next time, read the label, trust your own taste buds, and protect your plate.